The birth and rise of the asylum was evidence of a massive confinement of people who were not sick, but merely inconvenient. Foucault. What were conditions like in asylums?
So conditions in asylums were, I think, mixed. In some places, they did indeed give people a refuge and the notion of work therapy, because institutions were primarily, the machinery of the institution was primarily provided by patients. Patients did the laundry, patients did the cooking, patients grew the vegetables, patients did the gardening. And that was all considered part of their therapy. And for some people in emotional stress, that might have actually been, a not like a reasonable life. But there were many, many things that I think that happened in institutions that would horrify us today and would greatly upset us if we thought that someone we cared about was being subject to those kinds of treatments. Solitary confinement, incredible overcrowding, particularly by the 1950s, when institutional populations in the mental health world were at their peak in Canada. Treatment that we would consider brutal and senseless today, things like lobotomies were practiced in certain parts of Canada. Sterilization, sexual sterilization of men and of women was not uncommon in institutional populations, and in fact it was the law in Alberta and British Columbia for a big chunk of the 20th century. Even if it wasn't on the law books in other parts of Canada, it was practiced amongst institutionalized populations. So there's a lot of pieces of that picture of the madhouse which was in direct opposition to the concept of human rights as we know it today. And there were many, many things that happened in those institutions which I think that we should be very ashamed of as a society.
In the early 1800s, people with mental illness were thought to be rejects by God, and that their lack of faith was the cause for their suffering. Physicians believed that 80% of mental illness could be cured if done outside the home. Thus began the age of building massive structures called asylums. Initially, it was thought that asylums, in order to provide proper treatment support, should be no larger than 250 beds. From 1870 to 1880, the population of people in the U.S. classified as insane increased by 145%. Here, we see a list of the reasons you could be admitted to an asylum. Kicked in the head by a horse, hysteria, immoral life, egotism, fever and jealousy, asthma, superstition, smallpox, greediness, grief, business nerves, female disease, feebleness of intellect. The laws at that time allowed people to be involuntarily committed. Husbands could commit their wives for disobedience, failing to adopt their religion, and for incompatibility. And while the commitment rates for men and women were comparable, gender inequality certainly was a factor in women being involuntarily committed. Children could also be involuntarily committed for being unruly, and wealthy parents who simply didn't want to deal with disruptive children could also have them committed. How was madness redefined in the 100-year period of institutionalization?
I think that madness is very interesting to look at as a category historically, because in many ways, what is considered mad is a mirror of what makes society uncomfortable. So, in 1973, homosexuality was taken off the hit list, the DSM, or Diagnostics and Statistics Manual hit list of the American Psychiatric Association. And, thousands of homosexuals were cured of mental illness overnight. It was the most successful treatment moment it was the most successful moment for mental health, really, historically. But similarly, as our notions of morality have changed, so too has society and the powers that be, pathologization of women's morality has changed. I think that, however, now today we're pathologizing, and I see the psychiatric, psych professions, broadly speaking, now looking very carefully at transgender behaviors. And I find it quite interesting the way in which they're being kind of conceptualized as mental health issues today.
How did people feel about asylums? Many opponents felt these large facilities were more like prisons and less like hospitals. The Kirkbride architectural plan, designed by Thomas Story Kirkbride, became the popular asylum design in the United States. By 1890, approximately 70 facilities were built using this design. The characteristics of the Kirkbride design included a pavilion in the middle of the linear corridors and were 3 stories high. The Friends Asylum for the Relief of Persons Deprived of the Use of Their Reason, which is located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was actually the first private non-profit, exclusively designed facility for mental health services in the United States, and it still continues that rich tradition today. One of the most notorious asylums in the United States was the Blackwell Island Asylum in New York. Blackwell Asylum was a publicly owned institution that was located on Blackwell Island along with 10 other institutions. On the day the 200-bed Blackwell Asylum opened, there were 197 admissions. By 1848, an additional 66-bed facility was built that housed 190 women. Investigative journalist Nellie Bly, encouraged by her newspaper to write a story about the infamous asylum, pretended to be mentally ill so that she could be admitted. But before she could get admitted, she changed her name to Nellie Brown. To begin the process of faking insanity, she checked herself into a woman's group home where she would begin acting strange in order for the group home to make a referral. She did such a good job, the other occupants in the home didn't want to sleep with her in the house. She would be taken into police custody, where she would undergo several medical exams at Bellevue Hospital. Nellie Bly noted that it wasn't very hard to fake being crazy. The court system obliged, and she soon found herself admitted to Blackwell Island Lunatic Asylum. What Nellie would experience over the next 10 days would become the content used for her expose detailing the horrible treatment of the patients. The patients were given improper clothing and were expected to live in freezing conditions. The food was inedible, and complaints to the administrator created problems for the complainant. Nellie found many of the inhabitants were perfectly fine. One of the inhabitants was placed in the asylum because she was accused of having an affair. Another was placed there because she was poor and asked for public assistance. Beatings, pinching, choking, and being forced to take narcotics was commonplace, and the nurses were described as cruel. Privacy was not permitted, and there was sexual abuse. Patients were bathed once a week in the same tub using the same water. Residents also had to use the same towels. Nellie described the Blackwell Asylum as a human rat trap. After Nellie was released from the asylum, she published her story in the local newspaper. Nellie was asked to speak to the grand jury and answer questions about her experience in the Blackwell Asylum. Many of the people that Nellie described in her expose could not be found when grand jurors returned to interview them. In spite of the attempt of the asylum to cover up the issues cited in Nellie's report, the grand jury concluded there were significant problems in the institution. Because of Nellie's expose, the state awarded an additional $1 million in appropriations to the asylum. Crownsville Hospital in Maryland is a glaring reminder of the impact of racism on the care of vulnerable African American citizens. Tales of Black citizens being kidnapped for experimentation and laboratories for eugenics were plentiful. Locals voiced that being Black meant being criminalized and being crazy. In March of 1911, 12 African Americans were transferred from their mental institutions and housed on the grounds of the construction site for what would become the Negro Hospital for the Insane of Maryland. Local media had reported on the practice of using patients as construction workers. The facility owners coined their efforts as therapy. By the end of the year, there would be over 70 patients housed on the property during the construction phase. There was no documentation of white work camps to build the white asylum near Crownsville. Additionally, from 1921 to 1923, 21% of the people at Crownsville died, as opposed to the neighboring white asylum that had a death rate of 9.8. There was considerable concern expressed by the public that the first architectural design of the facility would appear too elaborate for Negroes. It was decided to adopt a cottage design to allow for future growth. The name Negro Hospital for the Insane of Maryland would later be changed to Crownsville State Hospital in an effort to remove the term insane from the name of the building. During the time of World War I, Crownsville patients were loaned to local businesses as labor, and Crownsville had become known for high employee turnover and unskilled staff expected to carry large patient loads. According to research by Ty, the average staff-to-patient ratio in similar facilities in 1944 was 1 employee to 8 patients. At Crownsville, that staff-to-patient ratio was 1 worker to 27 patients. Sadly, during this era, many white physicians reported Black people being more susceptible to mental illness and depression as a result of their reduced intellect. Overall seen as an inferior subclass, the health care given to Black citizens was subpar. Crownsville patients were treated horribly. Residents died at the hands of staff and were subjected to severe beatings. Overcrowding was also a concern. By 1947, Crownsville was operating at 600 patients over capacity. Many experimental procedures were performed on the patients at Crownsville. Lobotomies, hydrotherapy, and shock therapy treatments were common. Even in death, the Crownsville patients were not treated with dignity. According to published reports, Black bodies were held for as long as 14 days, then released to the local anatomical board for dissection and experimentation. For the duration of the operation of the asylum, over 1,600 people were buried in unmarked graves. A review of records indicated much fewer bodies were actually buried in the cemetery on the grounds. In fact, More bodies were sent to the University of Maryland Medical School and then callously cremated. After 12 years of indecision by local health officials in Maryland, the Crownsville Hospital closed in 2004, citing advances in the care of people with psychiatric disabilities and a reduced need for inpatient treatment. Where did the concept of eugenics originate? When was it most widespread? And when did it dissipate?
The notion of eugenics, the conceptualization that there are hereditary traits that mark who you are, your intelligence, your mental capacity, and your physical strength, was the brainchild of Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And it was a 19th century idea that percolated in Britain and started by the early 20th century to find expression in public policy in Britain and then in many other parts of the world, including Canada. In Canada, two provinces, Alberta and British Columbia, had sexual sterilization of people deemed mentally unfit on the books by the 1920s. And these laws in BC and Alberta, to make it clear, were not repealed until the 1970s. So Alberta, we have the greatest evidence from Alberta. But perhaps I'll tell you the story of one victim of eugenicist policies in Alberta, a woman called Doreen Beffes, who was born in Medicine Hat, Alberta in the 1920s. And her early life was shaped by, I think, 3 pertinent factors. She was born a twin, and she was quite sickly as a baby. And she was born into a impoverished and unstable family. So her parents separated when she was very young. But I think the third thing that's quite pertinent is she was born with an extra toe on each foot. And although that toe was surgically removed at a young age, I think it marked her as different. And her uncertain health marked her as vulnerable, as did her fragmented family life and the working class origins of her family. So she was taken as a ward of the state and institutionalized at what was later called the Michener Institution in Red Deer, Alberta. When she was a teenager, she was sexually sterilized. She probably was not told what was happening to her. It happened to most of the children, the adolescents at the Michener, and it was never explained to them, or they never gave their consent. Their parents never gave their consent if they had parents. Why? Because they had changed the law, so that was not necessary. And in the 1970s, Doreen came out of the institution and lived out her life in the community and became an activist and a writer. But she's an illustration. In that sense, she's an unusual illustration of someone who is the victim of eugenicist policies and practices, in that she became an activist and a writer. But if you read her writing, it's so clear that the assessment of her intellectual capabilities was just total. And the story of Doreen is it brings out a real sense of profound injustice, but also just like this, it's a very sad story, and it's very inspiring to think that she managed to do everything she did in her life with being treated in such an unjust way. So eugenics policies were profoundly destructive for the individuals whose lives they impinged upon.
In 1917, a government statute excluded all idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded persons, epileptics, and insane persons from immigration to the United States.
The wet pack consisted of packing, that is, wrapping, patients in wet sheets. This next procedure, the continuous bath, was kept at 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Its aim was to sedate patients. Hot boxes and lamps were used in order to help relax patients. A predecessor to electroconvulsive therapy was insulin therapy, although this approach was more dangerous and less effective than ECT has since become. Insulin therapy was developed by Viennese physician Manfred Sackel. It was used primarily on patients with schizophrenia. The idea was to give patients insulin, which would make their blood sugar drop. The patient would then slip into a coma, and most importantly would experience a convulsive reaction. One form of reaction brought about by insulin therapy was called wet shock because it included profuse sweating and drooling, as seen here. Another reaction brought on by insulin therapy was so-called dry shock, involving a full brain seizure. Glucose, given by nasal tube or by injection, was needed to bring patients out of their insulin-induced coma. Metrazole therapy, an intravenous injection of metrazole on patients, again primarily with schizophrenia, was another form of convulsive therapy that was used prior to ECT or electroconvulsive therapy. It was developed by Hungarian physician Vanislav Meduna, and the intravenous injection of metrazole typically produced grand mal type seizure. Finally, one of the most notorious of all early procedures was the lobotomy.
Mental health institutions throughout Europe and the USA have become dangerously overcrowded. During the 19th century, where scientific discovery took leaps and bounds, many attempts to treat the mentally ill had failed, leading to a large population of incurable patients. This was due to many industrialised countries having national systems of regulated asylums. These institutions sought out care for patients that had been disposed of in the system by their families, poorhouses, and the criminal justice system. There are many gruesome types of treatment on offer in the early 20th century. In 1917, malaria therapy was introduced, where a patient would be deliberately infected with the zoonotic disease to induce fever to fight neurosyphilis. In 1920, the barbiturate-induced deep sleep therapy for premature dementia, aka precocious madness, or in its modern name form, schizophrenia. This treatment used drugs to keep patients unconscious for days or even weeks. In 1927, you might have been given insulin shock treatment, which used the peptide hormone to introduce daily comas. In 1934, patients could be prescribed with the first type of seizure therapy, where a patient would be deliberately induced into convulsions by the use of PTZ. This therapy would be superseded by the more familiar electroshock therapy. Although these treatments could cause long-term lasting psychological and physical trauma, The patient had not undergone a surgical procedure to eradicate the disorder. Walter thought that the lobotomy could be streamlined even further still. The new standard procedure had the same shortcoming of the Moniz method, and that was access to the brain. You see, cutting through the patient's skull required the operation to be conducted in an operating theatre, with all the trappings, anaesthesiologist, qualified surgeon, hygiene, and so on and so forth. To get a lobotomy in its late 1940s peak, you really didn't need to have much of a mental health condition, with the treatment touted for all kinds of ailments. The list of treatable illnesses with a lobotomy included, but was certainly not limited to, ADD, OCD, anxiety, PTSD, postnatal depression, chronic pain, Alzheimer's, criminality, and violent outbursts. Freeman, ever the showman, was responsible for a patient's death in 1951 when pausing a lobotomy to pose for a photo, in doing so causing severe brain hemorrhaging. He was even known to lobotomise 2 patients at the same time, one with each hand. The doctor even performed the operation on minors, including children as young as 4. In total, around 15% of patients who received the lobotomy died, but many more were changed for life, a shell of what they once were. For those who survived the ordeal, relapse would often follow. Soviet psychologist Dr. Nikolai Orozhevsky was quoted saying that lobotomies violate the principles of humanity, and that was from an official from 1950s USSR. The procedure gradually fell out of vogue, but Freeman would continue to perform the lobotomy all the way until 1967, when after their third lobotomy, one of Walter's patients died of a hemorrhage. This final procedure would get him banned from performing it ever again. The USSR wouldn't be the last to ban lobotomies, as even Moniz's Portugal would disallow the procedure from use. With further developments in drugs such as SSRIs, antipsychotics, and types of therapy like CBT, the need for surgical intervention slowly faded away, and by the 1980s, lobotomy became a thing of the past.
How has the long period of institutionalization impacted the modern era?
It's really important when you look at the history of deinstitutionalization to really put the people who received mental health services in the community front and center of looking at that. And certainly deinstitutionalization and community mental health care has its deep flaws. But one thing that is really important that came out of deinstitutionalization was the notion of patients as actors, as patients as people with rights, people with ideas about what they needed, about people who were prepared to be activists. And there's many activist patients, people like David Revel, who was the first Canadian politician to be out of the closet as a former mental health patient, and will be receiving his honorary doctorate at Queen's in June, and I'll be there. But there's when people came out of institutions and the focus of mental health became community-based, it gave people a chance to come together as a social movement. And I think that has been more or less successful, but one of the greatest success stories in Canada is, in terms of that, is the first group of former mental patients who got together and created their own services in Vancouver in the early 1970s, the MPA, or Mental Patients Association, who created a very innovative and very patient-centered program or set of services that were in many ways unparalleled to this day. Their success is in many ways unparalleled to this day. And so as one of the founders of the MPA said, Molly Dexel said at the time, we are the shadow people. But in a sense, Molly Dexel also illustrates a person that refused to be a shadow person, having been institutionalized by her husband many times and receiving apparently as many as 100 shock therapy treatments. Molly, as an older woman, came out of Riverview, joined the MPA, and spent the rest of her life writing and speaking publicly and working in the system to better the lives of other people who use mental health services. So although people with mental health difficulties still are the shadow people, because we don't institutionalize them, we can't actually ignore them the way that we might have in the past before deinstitutionalization. And I think that's probably a good thing.